Feels like forever since I've done one of these
I
episodes.
was going to say, when were you in the last one of these? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 8 of the Osint Bunker podcast. This week it's myself, Jordan, and Technical. Tom, unfortunately, is not with us this week due to some important exams that he's got going on. But you'll have the pleasure of us three this week discussing the G7 conference that's currently going on, the whole Afghanistan situation, and a variety of other topics from the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, so I guess, let's just start off for right now with the G7, because it's going to be the easiest for us to get out of the way, because obviously it's happening in certain members' backyards. Um, well, relative backyards, but yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how things are evolving there. Not a return to normalcy per se, because everything's sort of been super weird over the past year, but definitely a return to your standard diplomatic conferences that we've seen in the past.
So obviously we've got at the G7, we've got the standard G7 ministers, and we've also got a bunch of the invited guests who made it over yesterday, such as South Africa and India.
The
Yeah,
Australians are there.
Yes.
yeah, you've got the Australian Prime Minister, South Korea's President, and South Africa's President attending in person, and India's Prime Minister is attending virtually due to the ongoing COVID situation over there.
Yeah, but as of right now, definitely this meeting is not just the G7. I mean, yes, it's the G7, but it has attracted a number of different dignitaries and leaders from around the world, just to, I guess, sort of have the first somewhat normal meeting since the pandemic happened, since the pandemic started, screwing up everything. Um, Not saying it's maybe a victory lap for defeating the pandemic, because that would be a bit early. As we've seen, the Indian Prime Minister is attending remotely due to the pandemic in India. So I would say it definitely seems like, at least for right now, they're trying. One of the first things they're trying to hash out is global vaccine distribution. The U.S. at this point has a lot more vaccines than people to actually vaccinate. Um, so we're definitely seeing that as sort of a, how do I put this, a cleaving issue among some of the countries attending. Certainly, because the G7 is more, those first world nations that have the largest economies, and so by the nature of how they've rolled out their vaccination programs, are also the first nations to really get a very high level of vaccinations out. So we're gonna see that over the next few days. The big thing that we saw was the new plan to counter Chinese investment in developing countries. That's definitely going to be pretty large, especially as I know we've talked about on here before how sort of the West has not entirely abdicated any responsibility in forming development in developing countries, but more just sort of letting private industry and partnerships take the lead, while actual government support sort of sits in the back. Um, so we're probably going to see a good amount of pure capital investment, actually building capital projects in these countries, which is definitely going to be interesting to see as China more moves from an economic role into a, I guess, a closer partnership with these countries, including at some point, deploying military assets. We're probably going to see that. That is the end game for everything, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, we've talked before, haven't we, about the rate at which China's military expansion is occurring. it's pumping out new warships at a rate that is, well, not quite unparalleled. I think the Americans could probably argue to have had a higher rate of production during the Second World War, but certainly
then, not now.
certainly in the modern world, it is just astonishing the rate at which they are able to build equipment and get it deployed. And yeah, we're seeing a lot of alliances between China and different countries, both in Africa and in South America as well.
Yeah, and their recent at least exploratory plan to develop the runway in Kiribati, which is definitely interesting because that was a former U.S. base in the area that was used fairly heavily during the Second World War. But additionally, it is fairly close to Hawaii and pretty much sits at the crossroads of a few major trading links between Asia and the entirety of North and South America. So it might not be entirely military attention at this moment, but capital investment coming from the Chinese government. I mean, sort of drawing the difference between, capital investment and whatever the Chinese government is doing is fairly hard. But it definitely serves as a sign of, one, this is the furthest east they've gone so far, investment wise, not counting investments in South America. But in that Pacific region, that's pretty far east. And again, it's pretty hard to sink an island, which means it can serve as a very important asset. In addition, the nation of Kiribati has 2 years ago broke relations with Taiwan and established relations with China, or the communist China, the People's Republic of China, not the Republic of China. So at this point, they're definitely a friendly nation, which means they sort of, their purpose has changed. So that's one of the things, of course, that the G7 is going to be working to counter. I actually think possibly the Kiribati thing scared a number of nations into taking some further action. That's definitely something that I probably could see happening. And then I think the final thing we should probably touch on with the G7 would be the climate issue. That has taken, at least for these, the first day or two, has taken up a lot of attention with these leaders. I know Prince Charles led a discussion last night. We're recording this on Saturday, about the environmental future. So he's definitely leading that interest. It's actually going to be interesting to see how the royal family sort of takes a role, because they've always had, the sort of, at least over the past 60 or 70 years, less of the statesmanship role and more of course, the leader of humanitarian and interest roles. Whereas before they had, of course, the state role. I guess you guys could talk about that in a bit more detail than I could.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of scrolling through a lot of the tweets from the different world leaders at the G7 earlier today, and it, like you say, it is a major topic of interest for them at the moment, and for the start of the conference at the very least. Canada being very vocal about it, which doesn't really come as any surprise. The EU less so, I would imagine. From what I saw of tweets from the EU, they were more focused on the diplomacy and everything that the G7 affords, and they made a note in particular about education and foreign aid, which has obviously been a topic of contention here in the UK in the last couple of months, with plans for the aid budget to be slashed. On that topic, the UK did actually pledge today a further £430 million towards the Global Partnership for Education, which is always good to see. But yeah, obviously we're one day into the into the G7 summit, it has been, as you say, mostly focused on environmental stuff for the moment. There was a tweet by the UK Foreign Secretary which did pique my interest earlier, meeting obviously with Secretary of State Blinken, and it was interesting the way that he worded the tweet, and we'll put the link for this in the description on YouTube. But they were very specific reference to a coordinated approach on dealing with Russia. Now, obviously, the G7 would be the G8 if Russia were invited. Russia's been kept out of the group now for some time due to obviously some of the issues that have happened in recent years.
It was Ukraine that was the main cleave event that sort of got them kicked out.
Yeah, I mean, you've had Ukraine, you've had the Salisbury Novichok poisonings, you've had so many different things going on, cyber attacks and everything else. So, they're still not really part of the group anymore. And whether that changes or not, I don't know. What exactly a coordinated approach to Russia looks like, I'm sure we'll see fleshed out a little bit more in detail in the coming days. But
yeah, and a big element of meetings like this, of course, isn't exactly meetings between the main leaders, is the meetings between their undersecretaries and and the people who actually make and enact policy. And that's one of the main things with the G7 is seeing those meetings between, of course, people like Rob and Blinken, of course, because they're both physically there, they're both physically doing things.
Yeah.
And that's certainly a big thing. And of course, meeting with their other G7 plus, whoever else showed up. I mean, there are a lot of countries right now in Cornwall, and a lot of leadership there as well. I mean, it's not the G20 right now, but it's pretty much the not exactly the NATO, but certainly the a more U.S. and European sphere of influence countries meeting. So that's something certainly interesting to see as well. And then I guess things I expect to come out of this meeting. I think they've outlined most of the big things. Of course, Russia. I mean, the tweet from Rob pretty much outlines it fairly clearly. Russia, climate change, global human rights. Myanmar, of course, that's something that people are protesting them to talk about. One thing I have found sort of funny is that there are people, protesting for action to be taken against Myanmar. But my question is, short of an actual intervention, there isn't really much the West can do as a whole there. And I think the people advocating for something to be done also probably wouldn't want an invasion. People initially when the coup happened were joking about 10 years in the future after the NATO intervention in Myanmar, what the absolute bushfire war would still look like. And I think it raises sort of a big point of interventions are certainly a lot less in the vogue after the post-Soviet collapse in the 90s and the sort of through that period in the 90s and early 2000s, getting militarily involved in issues was certainly popular, and sort of the aftermath of that has waned.
There's definitely a lot of sort of a lack of political will now. I think that's obviously partly because of some of the interventions that have occurred more recently. And the outcomes of those, and you've also obviously got the fact that people back home now, with the advent of media in sort of the late 90s, really sort of covering everything that's going on in a conflict, and those images being sort of transmitted back home unfiltered, it has affected the way that governments look to deal with these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I think it was more the change from early success in the first Gulf War and the intervention in the Balkans into this period of sort of disaster after disaster in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think that's actually probably a pretty good time to transfer over and shift gears into the developing disaster in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, it is. It's not good. Ever since the U.S. announced that it would be pulling out all troops by the 11th of September of this year, so that 2021, um, the troop pullout has been happening very quickly. Already half of the U.S. troops and assets are out of the country. There weren't that many there in the first place, but the U.S. still had a lot of equipment and physical supplies left, and physical assets. Um, so, I mean, we don't. The number of troops was somewhere between, I don't know, 2,000 and 5,000. The U.S. uses a lot of bureaucratic methods to hide the true number of troops in country, but it was somewhere in that neighborhood.
yeah,
And so about 50% are out now. And something I've also seen is U.S. air support for Afghan troops has effectively disintegrated,
yeah,
um, which is slightly terrifying because the Taliban have also started over the past couple of months, ever since the U.S. confirmed and then actually started withdrawing troops. The Taliban started a fairly furious summer offensive. Um, and one of the main things that we've seen is a couple of Taliban groups, and I'll throw up a map on the screen here from Live UA Map, which these guys are great and really good at turning the tweets that a lot of people send out and turning a lot of information that gets out there into something that's easily digestible. And I know in Afghanistan, just due to the nature of how the country is built, it's a lot harder to follow along with most of the action, unlike, somewhere like Iraq where most of this stuff happens in a few places. Um,
yeah. I
and
mean,
so sort of
we've had one incident, particularly recently on that matter that sort of leapt out at me, and I think the information came from these live UA maps, as you're saying. On the 8th of June, so that was what, a few days ago.
be 4 days ago now.
The Afghan government admitted that 157 members of the National Security Forces had been killed in the previous 24 hours due to fighting with groups like the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and Islamic State.
So really interesting with that. A lot of us, apart from the absolute horror of that death count, um, what was fairly interesting is that's a fairly abnormal number to see. So obviously the fighting is coming very heavily. It it doesn't seem from the amount of fighting we've seen that it's entirely correct, and some of us watching it are sort of confused if or why the Afghan government would be putting out I, almost artificially inflated numbers of death counts. It all comes down to the fact that most of the fighting we've seen has actually been Afghan army troops retreating and Afghan police troops retreating and giving up territory.
Yeah,
When the Taliban is able to mass enough fighters to actually present a problem to them. One thing I can just think of right now is Merker, which is outside of Ghazni. It's on the road between Kandahar and Kabul. That main artery. Um, it's a town sitting on the road, and the Taliban effectively captured it without much fighting. The Afghan government forces retreated. I think that's partially because of one, the Taliban, instead of executing government forces, they did this a while ago, but it's now being heavily seen a lot more now. They just let them go if they surrender. They basically just give them money, give them a written up explanation, sort of serving as a pass if they run into any more Taliban forces, and then they just like send them home. Um, so it's become fairly attractive for Afghan army forces to surrender to Taliban forces. One, because there's just this lack of U.S. air support right now. That did change in the last like 24 or 48 hours. I think the U.S. finally realized sort of what was happening and resumed some airstrikes. But without that U.S. air support, I don't think these guys really want to fight that much. Um, and the option of surrendering is fairly attractive, at least as of right now. And that sort of brings us into the future. I had the chance to talk with a few people about the potential future of Afghanistan. Because at this point, I think all of us can probably agree that the Afghan central government, at least outside of Kabul, the days are limited.
Yeah. There was an analysis piece done recently by one of the major think tanks in the open sources intelligence community, and they estimate that at the moment, the way things are heading, by the time US forces fully withdraw later this year, the Afghan government will probably only control somewhere between 10 and 15% of Afghan territory. The rest of it being either actively fought over or under control of groups like the Taliban and Al Qaeda. And that is really terrifying, to be perfectly honest. Especially when you bear in mind, Operation Enduring Freedom was, started 20 years ago, and for us to have gone from where things were then to this point now, where realistically the situation is no better, something needs to be done, and the Americans are indicating that they're not willing to carry on doing something.
I mean, let's be honest here. In 2020, 10 American service members died in Afghanistan. 4 were combat deaths. So you have to see, this whole situation, and one, the U.S. maintenance forces were small, and the U.S. had developed this strategy where we could really assist the current Afghan government in keeping the Taliban under control through, limited airstrikes and, limited troop presence in country. As I said, I think in an earlier podcast, this is honestly, the withdrawal was not a military or even geopolitically influenced move. It was a move designed to give a win to the current government in the U.S. By saying, we ended the war in Afghanistan. Well, that's like saying we ended the war in Vietnam. Except Afghanistan, counterintuitively was a much easier war to actually win than the war in Vietnam at that point. Just because, we had a very, as I said, a very small maintenance force taking extremely minimal casualties on a year-over-year basis. Which just leads you to sort of think, at what point do we say we lost? Do we say we lost, and I say we at this point because pretty much every NATO country at some point was involved in Afghanistan and lost troops in Afghanistan. And not just that, but a number of outside of NATO countries participated in the coalition and lost troops and spent a lot of money on this. At what point do we say, we've returned to the status quo of the 1990s? Except this time, there's not just the Taliban. There's, Al Qaeda groups who have turned into Islamic State groups who now actually control territory, as we saw when they attacked and killed a number of members of a mine clearing operation in Afghanistan. They're still present. They still hold territory now. And at what point do we say we lost? Do we say we lost now? Or do we say we lost in 3 months from now, when the U.S. is gone on September 12th, and the Taliban has effectively controlled most of the country? Or do we say we lost when the Taliban rolls into Kabul? It's sort of this question of at what point do we say, well, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and obviously at the moment the mission there is known as Operation Freedom's Sentinel. And as you mentioned, there are a number of other coalition nations still involved. I think I did a quick check today, and there's something like 35 nations have personnel currently still deployed in Afghanistan. I suspect that when the US withdraws, given that the US, the combination of US and UK troops makes up a third of the military personnel deployed there at the moment, I suspect we will see a lot of those 33 other countries withdraw their people as well.
Well, the withdrawals have already happened from the UK. Is they've been forward basing C-17s in the UAE to fly their equipment out, and the Germans last week dispatched an A400M to do their withdrawal, and the Italians have been flying KC-767s
Yeah, that
in the
they're
transport route
tankers.
in a tank to transport their personnel and supplies out.
And the US,
Yeah,
UK, Germany, and Italy are the 4 biggest nations out there in terms of military presence.
and I'm fairly sure the smaller countries as well, who don't have exactly the most robust transport networks in the region, are contracting to have troops and supplies not evacuated per se, but withdrawn.
I think they'll probably also be hopping on and contracting or just getting assistance from the UK and the US with much larger transport fleets.
Yeah, it's definitely something. Of course, at this point, we're seeing it's a fairly complete withdrawal of coalition troops, and what do we see after that? What does Afghanistan become as a country? Afghanistan's air force has been fairly beefed up. In the past 20 years, does the Taliban now control 60 coin aircraft? And it's this question of what does the country look like? Because it was fairly weird after the 1990 or during the 1990s, especially with the country wasn't really under one single party control. There were a bunch of different parties that controlled various portions. It was fairly close to a warlord society at that point, with the Taliban running around in pockets. But we've obviously, and one of the main things that I can say now for sure is the Northern Alliance, former Northern Alliance members who fought the Taliban during the 1990s and then fought with coalition forces, but especially the U.S. In 2001 and 2002 to defeat the Taliban. They are starting to reform their forces and recruit new militants and sort of start to coalesce this area in northern Afghanistan where they can resist sort of Taliban attacks. And it risks evolving into a civil war. I think definitely we're gonna see support again for the Northern Alliance, but it sort of just returns us to this 1990s status quo where Afghanistan becomes this base again. And I think some of us talked before about who actually enters Afghanistan next. What major power decides to try to intervene there? I know I talked with some people who are experts on China, who actually study China, and it's sort of a toss-up whether or not China decides to do something in Afghanistan. The Pakistani support, Pakistan is a Chinese ally, the Pakistanis support the Taliban. So it might actually be in China's best interest to have the Taliban stay in power in Afghanistan. Additionally, on top of that, what we're seeing with the Uyghur population in Western China is that China has this new, fairly aggressive policy against any sort of Muslim descent or Muslims, period. And so they may come up with some sort of excuse that is, Afghanistan is serving as a hotbed of terrorism that's on our border, and and it's a vested interest in ours to prevent terror, and U.S. and the West gave up on trying to stop that, and so we're going to step in. But again, they don't want to get into a bushfire war, and going back to what we were talking about with the Chinese military, they sort of have this two-tier operation where one tier is, their bottom tier is kinetic military, which is they're building amphibious forces and they're building up their air force, but that's primarily focused on their eastern coast, and the first island chain, and countering U.S. influence there. But they don't really have, as we've seen in their clashes with India, the most competent ground forces. So it's sort of moving forward. It's sort of this very complex geopolitical situation, but can definitely be framed when you basically classify it as Pakistan helps the Taliban, China is friendly with Pakistan, the U.S. is also friendly with Pakistan, but the U.S. is against the Taliban. Um, and so it very quickly you start from this simple starting point to this very very complex series of relationships in the region.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering as well that China's focus for the moment, at the very least, is on Taiwan and the first island chain and Asia Pacific, and that's part of the reason that obviously the UK carrier strike group is heading out that way, and the Americans have been conducting numerous passings through the Taiwan Strait and so on in recent months. Um, yeah, I mean, like you say, I can see China potentially choosing to get involved in Afghanistan because ultimately there will be a vacuum when the US and the rest of the NATO forces leave. Um, whether that vacuum's filled by China or by someone else, or whether it potentially allows the Taliban and Al Qaeda and ISIS to sort of grow back effectively. Because it's fair to say, as you said, we've not won that fight really because they still exist, and it's going to be very much a case of whether or not they're able to grow back stronger, or at the very least grow back to a shadow of their former selves, and what that will have, what impact that will have on the rest of the world in the coming months and years.
Well, and the other thing that that was discussed was whether or not the Taliban have an interest in trying to put forward this forward-facing image of, we've changed since the 1990s, where the U.S. invaded us. The people of Afghanistan didn't want, foreign, invaders taking over. They obviously seem to want us to be in charge. They're going to possibly move from executing people in on football pitches to, just throwing them in prison. Um, it's this question of whether or not the Taliban tries to create this vaguely marketable image, where maybe they don't openly support Al Qaeda, and they put together this piecemeal force to attempt to for optic purposes to fight ISIS, ISIS K in the east of the country. Where they try to put forward this image of, yeah, we can govern Afghanistan. And that definitely is a question. I mean, we have seen with these, with these surrendering troops that ISIS has or not ISIS, sorry, the Taliban have somewhat changed their modus operandi, where they've gone from just killing surrendering troops to letting them go home and giving them, money for transport and, permission to travel. I think we've seen it change somewhat. It's just a question of whether or not it changes once they get into power. You guys want to move on to Carrier Strike Group?
Yeah, I'll talk about that. That's
awesome.
My area.
I was waiting for Jordan.
And on that
up.
depressing note of the Taliban becoming a mainstream government in the world.
So, updates on Carrier Strike Group. So, we've got HMS Queen Elizabeth, Fort Victoria, and I can't remember. I think it's Tide Surge is the Tide class tanker with it. I can't remember. They are in Italy. HMS Queen Elizabeth is in Augusta in Sicily, parked next to the Italian carrier Cavour.
A lot of F-35s. Lot of F-35s there.
With F-35s on, and Cavour's got the Harriers on board, so it's nice to see the old and the new.
Yeah, and the Cavour did spend some time in Norfolk, Virginia, getting rated on the F-35B. So once Italy finishes acquiring those, the Cavour will be operating that.
Yep.
Sort of sad seeing another country lose the
Harrier.
Harriers, but it's the F-35B is the successor to the Harrier. It is
whether we
a
like
better Harrier.
We've got HMS Defender in HN LMS Everston from the Netherlands. They are in Turkey and about to go into the Black Sea for a bit. They'll be there for a bit. We've got what Type 23 frigates are with it? I think we've got one Type 23 that is in Albania. We've got the other Type 23 that is in Spain, was in Alicante, and attached itself to NATO standing NATO Maritime Group 1 for a bit of time to work
Hang
with
on
the
a minute.
Spanish.
I think I've got the here we go. I've got the list here. So HMS Kent has assigned itself to standing NATO Maritime Group 2. And HMS Richmond spent a couple of days in Montenegro and is now, as you say, off elsewhere.
It's off elsewhere. So the whole group's broken up, and the submarine was in Gibraltar recently.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got the whole group broken up, and probably won't see the group merge together as such until at least 2 weeks until they finish the Black Sea patrol, and then you'll probably see them merge together before transiting the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
And once they get into the Indian Ocean, they'll be breaking off again.
Yeah, and we're going to get a probably quite a nice photo shoot when they do pass through Suez.
Yep.
Obviously, that will be a fairly major deal, given that the last time a British carrier passed through Suez was well over a decade ago now.
Do a meme, get it stuck.
Yeah, hopefully they won't be pulling an evergreen maneuver.
Yeah, they'll be doing there'll be a brief time sat in the Eastern Med while the carrier launches strikes on ISIS.
I heard it actually wouldn't be that brief of a time. Were there some more solid scheduling numbers given, or no?
I think it's being kept very secretive at the moment.
There's no scheduling because there's no dates for as such for when the group will reach certain areas of the world, because obviously they're breaking off to do their various diplomatic visits and relationship building.
I think the only firm date we've got for anything is the visit to Japan, which is towards the end of the deployment, before the ships turn around and come home.
Still don't have any idea for the route that it'll take on its way back home. Like, I don't think anyone.
Yeah, there's still debate as to whether it's going to come back the way that it heads out, by obviously going back through the Indian Ocean, back up through Suez and the Mediterranean, or whether it's going to head out across the Pacific, visit potentially the US West Coast, and then make its way back home round the bottom of South America from there. I think probably more likely to be back the way it's been going out.
Yeah.
Not least of all because of the distance for the Pacific leg of the journey. And also, I would imagine the Argentinians would not be too pleased if HMS Queen Elizabeth suddenly came round the bottom of South America and parked up outside the Falklands.
I mean, that would be the logical end to this situation.
Yeah.
Just park one of them permanently off, off the coast.
So that's pretty much what's been happening in the carrier strike group. Nothing really well, obviously did its exercise for the French, but it's just sitting in the Mediterranean doing diplomatic stuff and relationship building.
Well, that was I think that's honestly the number one most important thing that Carrier Strike Group 21 has done, which is sort of establish this, the fact that now, of course, once the Spanish finish getting their carrier situation figured out, and hopefully begin to operate the F-35 in a serious fashion, that definitely gives a number of NATO nations now, and once the Italians very, very soon get their F-35B operating off the Good Vor, that gives multiple nations located in Europe in NATO this 5th generation carrier capability, which not so much a deterrent to the recent Russian aggression, but certainly changes the situation somewhat.
I think globally, though, it says, look, if you're going to start something with NATO, be advised that several NATO nations now have very good expeditionary warfare capabilities and can sail up to your coast.
Yeah, and even if the US is... Honestly, I think most of this was driven by the fact that there was this US threat of withdrawal from NATO, and that certainly that threat has definitely degraded in the past year.
Yeah.
But it's definitely, and it's nice for the U.S. where the U.S. can say, instead of deploying a U.S. carrier strike group, the Italians can send a carrier strike group, which sort of removes some pressure off the U.S. to operate in some of these regions.
Yeah, and I think for what it's worth, President Trump's threats around NATO have kind of sort of got the other NATO nations to kind of sit up a little bit and pay a bit more attention and actually start acting a bit more. I think we've definitely seen. I don't know how much it has to do with the COVID-19 pandemic, but we've definitely seen an uptick in the last few months in the number of foreign warships deploying to various locations where you would normally see the US presence. I know, for example, you've got several European nations have sent ships out into the Indian Ocean and beyond. You've had port visits to the US, as you mentioned earlier, for Italian Navy vessels, among other things, which is all good to see, of course. But yeah, I think it's definitely, the whole NATO situation and the US relationship with NATO has definitely had an impact there, and a positive one.
Yeah, I think it started out as this negative threat that NATO nations handled well and were able to take and improve, and certainly develop a lot of attempt to develop self-sufficiency, and that's a big thing to have.
I think kind of what the problem happened is at the time of Trump's election, a lot of NATO nations were just sort of beginning a modernization program, so it didn't look great. Well, it looked like they weren't committing to stuff, but in reality, they were starting a modernization plan, as in modernization of armies and upgrades take an incredibly long time. Hence why it's taken a long time for Britain to get there. The Italians are going through a big naval program.
Yeah, and I think that was obviously it was certainly a factor that accelerated these programs that had already been established.
But obviously, we'll follow the carrier strike group as it moves around, as it leaves for the Eastern Mediterranean in a few days.
Yes, and that's something I think all of us will be watching very closely, because these will be the first offensive strikes that that the Queen Elizabeth, I believe, in an actual wartime situation partakes in, if I'm not incorrect.
You are correct. The F-35s have technically gone into combat previously by doing reconnaissance missions over Syria when they went to Akrotiri a few years ago.
Yeah. And like you say, this will be the first sort of combat test for the carrier, and it will be probably the biggest test for what it actually behaves like in real world situations, because as much as the ship and crew have gone through rigorous testing through various exercises, you can't ever really simulate what actual operations for something like Op Shader look like for a carrier until you actually go and perform those missions in actuality.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the big things. I'm not saying that the ISIS is a minor threat anymore, but they're definitely an easy enemy to practice on. The only caveat in that situation is, of course, the distance and the required tanker support required for strikes like that, and the Russians watching. They're going to that is going to be a big caveat. Is how much do the Russians watch the situation? Especially being based out of Latakia, having that S-400 system and the radar systems associated with that, watching any aircraft activity, that's going to be definitely a big thing to watch for.
Yeah, and they will. I imagine they will be keeping a very, very close eye on things, because obviously at the moment they don't really have a carrier as such. The Kuznetsov obviously had a major fire several months ago and has been sort of port bound ever since. Russia still doesn't seem to know whether it's going to be building a new carrier or whether it's going to be refitting the Kuznetsov again to try and get that operational.
They want to build a new carrier very badly.
Yeah,
they do not have the money to.
Yeah, and as I think we've mentioned before, they seem to come out with a new design every couple of months. Um, some of the designs are quite interesting. Some of them are just outright ridiculous. Um, it's almost you know it's almost a laugh sometimes seeing some of the ideas that they are proposing when they know, as well as the West does, that they really can't afford at the moment any sort of major warship building program. I mean,
Well, it's not only that they don't have the facilities to do it at the moment.
yeah,
Well,
They do not have the facilities to handle a large building project like that.
look when they were going for amphibious ships, they ended up asking the French to build them, and the French sold them to Egypt.
yeah,
That was really funny, and now the Egyptians have a fairly robust.
helicopter carrier, effectively, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what they basically ended up turning it into. But at this point, sort of, I think one of the main questions is, well, how effective do those strikes end up being? What issues do they find? Because of course you don't really know what things are going to look like until you're actually in combat. Um, and so I guess they will be finding that out shortly.
Yeah. And obviously, at the moment, the British F-35s are mainly going to be using paveway guided bombs. We're obviously hearing good news about projects for the replacement for Brimstone and various other weapons that are coming in, hopefully in the next couple of months to a couple of years. But yeah, like you say, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I'm sure there will be a great deal of MOD press coverage about strikes by the carrier strike group. And it will be interesting to see some of the photos and maybe even some of the videos that come from that.
Yeah, and of course, as always, if anyone from the MOD is listening, have camera will travel. But I think that's probably it for what we expect shortly from CSG 21. Um, there's Peru, but that we all know. So in Peru, leftist authoritarian gets elected. We'll see how the CIA handles that. I do not expect him to live more than a year. Just gonna put that out there.
CIA, allow us to introduce ourselves.
Yeah. Well, no one is interested. What? Honestly, I'm going to be honest and sort of drop the jokes on that for a second. But one of the main things that we saw from the coronavirus pandemic in South America was it drove a lot of, or frankly everywhere, but mainly in South America, just because the effects were so bad. Was that it drove a lot of extremism to both sides, and that is something about South America. There is this very strong, rural, socially conservative, fiscally very leftist base. Um, and we saw them definitely come out hard in this last election, where the other candidate was, this far right former daughter of a former far right president there, and it's just this sort of the effects that we've seen. I think the U.S. election would have been a lot different if the pandemic hit 8 months earlier.
Yeah.
The pretty much by the time the pandemic really started hitting, the primaries were practically over. But if it had happened, honestly, even 2 months earlier, we would have seen some very, very different outcomes probably from the U.S. election as well. And I guess we'll possibly see it over the next few years, but in general, and I'm putting a big in general in front of this statement, the world economy has begun to recover at a fairly rapid pace.
Yeah.
Apart from supply shortages that we're seeing, but we're seeing those get worked out slowly at this point. But that's generally the political situation in the world is we might have some more extreme leaders come out of this, for the better or for the worst. But I do think that the U.S. will pay very close attention to this. But again, this is not, an 80s U.S. government that, I will refrain from saying the name of the president, that was very interested in getting rid of leftist leaders in South America. But this definitely is a different government. They have a slightly different view of those things. But yeah, I think John, you wanted to go over the news stories.
Yeah. So obviously it's been a couple of weeks now since we did the last episode. So there's been a few developments in the world worth just briefly chatting about, I think. And the first one I want to bring up is Iran, and it's Iran's had quite a bit going on the last couple of weeks. I think it's fair to say. They've obviously got a ship that sunk very, very recently in the Gulf. They have another ship currently on its way to Venezuela with some military equipment for the Venezuelan government on board, which I know the Americans are looking very, very closely at the moment.
Well, fast attack boats armed with anti-ship cruise missiles, which
Yeah.
are certainly concerning.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting development, and not one that I personally would have ever seen coming. But there you go. That's the way Iran is in the current times. And then we've also had this whole thing with the obviously Iran's nuclear weapons program and the sort of the ongoing diplomatic efforts the US are trying to bring about a deal there. We've had this report on the 31st of May, the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency informing us that Iran is now very, very close to having a viable nuclear weapon, and that we could be looking at Iran being a nuclear capable power within sort of the next 6 or 7 weeks.
And obviously the Israelis are going to have something to say about that, most likely. And also, again, a lot of the predictions, I think we've been predicting that Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon in 1 to 2 years for the past probably 10 years, I think now.
Yeah.
So,
and then the Israelis hit the reset button and we reset the clock slightly.
I definitely think some of this pressure is overhyped.
Yeah.
Just with, some of the geopolitical situations.
But it is fair to say that Iran has very much stopped allowing the IAEA access to various nuclear facilities. And we've seen a lot of satellite imagery. There's a couple of really, really good accounts, Orion Intel, and a few other sort of the Intel Lab and a few other accounts on Twitter that you can follow, who have been looking at the satellite imagery recently for several of these Iranian nuclear facilities, and there's definitely some major expansions going on, some major work being done at those locations, which, the EU has issued some statements, the Americans have issued some statements. I think the Americans are still very much trying to push for a return to the JCPOA deal that was brought in the Obama administration. I think, in all fairness, it's probably beyond that point now. I don't think there's really a way back to that at this point. Not without some serious differences, but
I spent an earlier episode talking a bit about why returning to the JCPOA was the only politically available option for, I guess, both governments at the time, because the only other option is, war, and that won't be pretty. It's definitely something to think about whenever the JCPOA seems ridiculous.
Yeah. In other news, Croatia is to become the 5th export customer for France's Dassault Rafale, after it placed an order for 12 second-hand jets in a deal worth $1.2 billion. First of the jets will arrive in 2024, replacing the Soviet-era MiG-21 fish beds currently operated by the country. That's definitely a huge win for France. Obviously, like with the Typhoon, they have struggled a little bit with sort of export uptake. Egypt's been very, very good for the Rafale, so has more recently India, and now Croatia to add to that list is all good news.
Partially because it's ridiculously expensive to buy, operate, do anything with. Just because it's a fairly limited run aircraft. But but I do find that deal funny, as the Swedes and Saab are very, very, very angry they didn't go with the Gripen.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean there's another story that will come up a little bit shortly. It's interesting as well at the minute with the Gripen that obviously the current version is the E and F, known as the Gripen Next Generation. Obviously Brazil has taken an interest there, and there's orders there, but one of the more recent orders, which I'll come to in a minute, has been for the older C and D variant, and I don't know what that really says about the EF variant of the Gripen.
More expensive. That's what it says.
Well, yes, and maybe suggests that the capability improvements are not worth the extra price. I don't know.
Yeah, especially as the F-35 continues to come down in price, it becomes a very, very attractive option for a lot of these countries that the U.S. will export to. That also is a big caveat.
Yeah. As previously mentioned as well, obviously we've got Iran appears to be supplying Venezuela with these high-speed missile-armed attack boats. Satellite imagery showing the cargo ship in question before it departed had 7 of these boats on deck. I don't know if there would have been any others stored beneath deck that we can't see, or whether it's just the 7 boats for the time being.
If you look at the waterline, it's obvious that the ship is very, very, very full.
Yeah. Which obviously, as we mentioned, is a cause for concern, particularly for the US. Whether the US chooses to try and intercept the vessel remains to be seen. They have kind of stepped back in recent times when Iran has sent stuff to Venezuela. Whether there'll be a different response with this being actual sort of heavy-duty military equipment rather than just fuel, like I say, we'll just have to wait and see.
Iran is sending a frigate to presumably escort the formation, though.
There is one frigate style thing with it.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's definitely going to be interesting because this is their newest and arguably most capable current ship. So that's definitely going to be interesting to see.
The UK has announced that next year, for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, there will be a 4-day bank holiday. For the rest of the world, there will be a number of flypasts and a very special edition of the Trooping the Colour Parade, along with several other events that will no doubt be celebrated across the Commonwealth and indeed the wider world. A US F-35 deployed on HMS Queen Elizabeth had to make an emergency landing in Ibiza on the 2nd of June. I don't think we have actually found out definitively what it was that went wrong, have we?
Nah, not definitively. It had a burst tire, but no one knows when that was caused. But that seems there seems to be more at it than just the tire burst.
Yeah. So that was an interesting little detour for one of the jets on board, but it has been repaired, I believe, and it is back on board the ship now.
Yeah, it came back on early in the week, I think.
There are worse places to have to make an emergency landing.
How
Yeah,
convenient!
exactly.
It lands just in time for the summer season starting.
Indonesia has indicated that it will be spending $125 billion on a complete modernisation of its military by the mid-2040s. Details of the investment that it intends to make are somewhat sketchy at the moment. However, it is looking at purchasing Lockheed Martin's F-16V Viper variant of the Fighting Falcon, which is the Block 70 they're calling it now?
70, 72, yeah.
Block 70
Depends
and
on what
72.
radar they go with.
Of that huge amount of money, the 79 billion of it will be for defence equipment, 32.5 billion for sustainment, and the remaining 13.5 billion will be to pay off interest on foreign loans for previous defence deals. On the topic of the F-16V, the Philippines announced that it lost the competition for the new Philippines fast jets. As I mentioned earlier, Saab's 39C Gripen won that contract. Originally, the request was for a total of 12 jets, a value of 1.2 billion. Saab have managed to offer 14 jets for that price, with delivery starting fairly soon. Whereas the Lockheed Martin offering was expected to cost 1.6 billion for just 12 jets, and delivery wouldn't begin until 2025 or 2026. That will obviously be a bit of a blow for Lockheed Martin, but yeah, as we sort of said, it's interesting that the Philippines have opted for the C and D variant of the Gripen rather than the newer E and F variant. I don't believe the price difference is that drastic, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that.
I believe the operating cost is different. I would have to double check on that, though.
Right. Portugal has sent 146 military personnel to Lithuania as part of a NATO operation there. Portugal has been deploying a lot of personnel recently on various NATO operations, which is, it's good to see. Arguably one of the smaller military forces in the alliance is really getting stuck in and involved at the moment, despite all the restrictions caused by COVID,
which are finally starting to lift somewhat. Europe especially will be allowing in Americans in piecemeal groups starting sometime soon, so that's nice to see.
Yeah, I don't know if we mentioned it in last episode, but there was obviously an incident in Belarus involving a Ryanair flight that was diverted, in inverted commas. On the 4th of June, the EU announced that as a result of that incident, all Belarus-based airlines flying in EU airspace would be banned from continuing to do so. So far as I'm aware, that ban is still in effect.
I do not believe they put an end date on it.
No, which does make for an interesting situation for Belarus, given its location on the continent and its neighbours. It kind of limits where Belarus-based flights can go. And a lot of European airlines have been advised to avoid Belarusian airspace because of it. Russia, notably, seems to have been fully in agreement with Belarus's actions, which, again, kind of just shows once again why Russia is still being kept out of the G7. All of the other G7 member states have been very, very clear that that kind of behaviour is not acceptable. Airbus has delivered the 100th A400M Atlas transport aircraft. The airframe in particular is the 10th for the Spanish Air Force. At the same time as this was happening, the global A400M fleet surpassed 100,000 flying hours, with a total at the moment of 174 aircraft on order for Spain, Germany, France, the UK, Malaysia, Luxembourg, Turkey and Belgium. It's fair to say the A400 has been quite a success story for Europe, although whether or not it's ever going to be able to truly challenge the Hercules, I mean, you're being American, I'm sure you're a big fan of the Hercules, and
the Hercules fills a different role. I would say the A400 is more in line to compete with the C-17.
Yeah,
it's weird because it sort of sits between the two, and
it does.
it's different. It's a prop aircraft, not jet, and it's turboprop and not jet. So it fills this sort of different role. Whereas I think all these countries still operate C-130s.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
fairly sure of. So I mean, it's not replacing the C-130 just because of the
Well, for
C-130's
the time being, at
unmatched
least. Yeah.
austere field. I don't think for a while. Just because of the C7 or the C-130's austere field conditions, which just absolutely, no offense, paint the floor with the A400 in certain situations. But again, the A400 is definitely a bit less or significantly less expensive to operate than the C17. Um, so yeah, it definitely has that role, and it fills it.
Yeah. Hyundai has unveiled its proposal for a future South Korean aircraft carrier. We'll post a photo of this on the video if we can.
It's big.
It's a phenomenal design. I mean, we all kind of knew that South Korea was looking at an aircraft carrier, but we were kind of expecting, I would imagine, something more along the lines of what they already have with
No,
their
no, they're swinging for the
their
fences with
helicopter.
this one.
Yeah, this. I've got to be honest. It looks like it could even be larger than both HMS Queen Elizabeth and even the French proposal for a future aircraft carrier at the minute. It's yeah. I mean the initial the model that has been unveiled at a defence exhibition is just astonishing, really, isn't it? And
I
notably,
have
the
to let me
F-35B is at the forefront of that.
I just have to look at it again for the proposal. Is it Stovall or Stobar? I keep
It's
trying to.
Stovall, yeah. So
Okay, it's Stovall, not Stobar.
it has a ski jump on the front, just like with the Queen Elizabeth, which is, you know, I suppose to a certain extent it's not really a surprise. That's, you know, it's proving to be a popular design concept at the minute. Um, Obviously, Britain's got them. Italy's got a similar design. Spain's got a similar design. Australia has ships that have a ski ramp, even though they don't operate the F-35B to even launch from those ships. But yeah, it's an impressive design, and if they do go ahead and build it, it will definitely cause a major shift in the balance of power in that sort of area of Asia Pacific.
Yeah. Well, the main thing is if they decide to build a carrier that large,
Yeah,
it's definitely going to take them some time to actually do it, and then of course actually achieve operational capability with it. Whereas if they went with a smaller design, they would most likely be able to achieve operational capability much sooner.
mm,
And
yeah,
that's probably a caveat that the government has to look at is, will the situation be the same in probably 2035 versus today,
yeah. And
or
realistically,
2030 probably.
this isn't a ship that we're going to see entering service imminently.
I mean, the Queen
Even with
Elizabeth
South
again
Korea's impressive
development.
industrial abilities.
I mean, the Queen Elizabeth was first revealed when 2000.
Yeah, we don't talk about that.
That was
I
a bit of
mean,
a project.
yeah, I think it would not be unreasonable to see a build time similar to the Gerald R. Ford class for something like this for South Korea.
Yeah, well,
It
probably a bit longer to be honest,
Yeah,
because we've
it
even
would
had
be a
issues.
huge undertaking if they go ahead with it. Um, who knows? We might. It'd be funny if Russia turns around now and asks for the design for their own carrier. Um, I can't,
Start fielding outside design houses to
yeah, I can't imagine South Korea would be too willing, but you never know.
the
Stranger
new
things have happened.
Porsche design house Kuznetsov carrier.
Yeah.
Just gonna start fielding outside stuff.
The US Navy has announced that the DDG-X project planning has begun. As many of you will be aware, the Arleigh Burke class destroyer was originally meant to have been replaced with the Zumwalt class. The Zumwalt class obviously got cut back to just 3 ships from an original plan of 32. And now the US Navy has announced that the replacement for the older Burke class, the DDG-X, that program is now underway, and they are hoping to bring the first ship of the class into service in 2032. I don't know if you've heard anything more about that on your end of the...
So one of the things about the Burke class is that, or one of the godsends at least, with the cancellation of the Zumwalt program, which in and of itself is a complete story, and I could spend an hour talking about it, is that the Burke has been very, very, very upgradable, and has been a very it's been a platform that takes upgrades very well. It's been a platform that can operate with them well, and I think even the new DDG-X program is probably going to end up looking very similar to the Burke.
Yeah.
Probably a bit more stealth, but at the end of the day, one of the things that they found with the Zumwalt program is that going very heavily towards stealth, your ability to upgrade, the ship goes away very quickly, and your cost goes up very quickly as well. And it's just, I honestly, the Burks are probably going to stay in service for a very long time, and they're going to keep receiving upgrades. The only real limiting thing to them right now is power plant, which at this point, with laser weapons starting to become incorporated into the Navy and the Navy's official plans, the power plant capability on the Burke is the only thing holding it back.
Yeah, and laser weapons, as you say, it's going to be a major thing for the future. The DDG-X, as it happens, it has now kind of been confirmed there will be no replacement for the Ticonderoga class cruisers. Judging from the press statement about the DDG-X, the plan is that whatever design comes from this program, it will replace both the Ticonderoga and the Arleigh Burke classes in terms of the mission set that it carries out.
I mean, the Burke is fairly close in size to the Ticonderoga, let's be honest.
Yeah, but obviously
they are
the original concept, and obviously the sheer amount of weapons carried by the Ticonderoga is, it's a capability that I know the US admirals were not keen to lose. Ultimately they could have replaced the Ticos at some point. They don't appear to be planning to now. It's going to be interesting to see whether this new design ends up being a hybrid destroyer or cruiser, and whether it will be better armed than the Burke class, which arguably is probably already the most heavily armed destroyer. Maybe you could argue there's a couple of Russian designs that are very close to it, if not slightly more powerful, but
well, I mean, in any other navy, it would be a cruiser.
Yeah.
The Ticonderoga displaces about 9,800 tons.
Yeah.
Whereas the Burke displaces
about 8,500, isn't it?
Yeah, and with some of the new upgrade packages, it's going to get over. It's going to get very close to 9,000. So they're very, very close in size at this point. Which again is why that new DDG-X program, that the main thing about them was, well, they're so close in size that we might as well just split the difference and create a single destroyer.
Yeah.
Which makes sense at the end of the day.
Yeah. Particularly with
the more you procure, the cheaper it gets. What we saw with the F-35, it's why the Zumwalt class ended up being so ridiculously expensive per ship.
Yeah. And particularly with the fact that the US Navy has reintroduced frigates now to its lineup, with obviously the 20 ships of the Constellation class either under construction or in planning. I think budgetary-wise, it makes sense to have frigates and destroyers rather than to be trying for frigates, destroyers, and cruisers. Obviously, that was something the Americans were able to do during the Cold War because there was funding and political willingness for funding for that kind of a fleet setup. But I think generally speaking, even the Russians are recognizing at this point that cruisers are not the way forward. They're
Yeah, because the Russians can't afford to build cruisers.
yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, their leader.
The Russian issue is a bit different because they don't have the money to do these things. I
Yeah.
mean, most of the stuff they focused on is upgrading older platforms built during the Soviet era, or just immediately post-Soviet.
And they've obviously been building a lot of frigates recently. You've had, you know, Admiral, what was his name? Admiral Grigorovich.
You think I know?
Yeah, well, I was hoping you'd know. You've had two
smart, I'm
major
not that
frigate
smart.
classes and a couple of other designs coming through, and obviously their leader class, which is supposed to be their DDGX, to all intents and purposes is a cruiser-sized vessel and is armed like a cruiser, but they have also designated it a destroyer. So there seems to be some sort of similar train of thought going on, both, you know, with the Russian Defense Ministry and the US Defense Ministry there.
Put a lot of missiles on boat. Boat becomes very useful. That's basically the end result of most development programs of the last 20 years. Just why I sometimes get confused with Royal Navy ship procurement. They definitely seem to be taking an at least an aggressive development plan to focus on the older type of thinking, at least with naval warfare. Whereas at least the US and Russia and even China somewhat is going towards this this one type of ship that can pretty much do everything.
Yeah.
And then of course an auxiliary class.
And our last news piece for today's episode, French President Macron has announced that the French military force operating in Mali under Operation Barkhane is to be completely overhauled and a new force to be deployed. Details as to what exactly he means by that haven't yet been released, but obviously that is a fairly major announcement. France has been involved in Mali for several years now and has more recently had the assistance of the UK with both ground support and Chinook helicopters assisting with various airlift operations across Mali. Clearly the situation in Mali is not going as well as France had hoped, and you know, like I say, it will remain to be seen what details, what changes are going to be made to Op Barkhane, and what this new force will look like and what its aims will be.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be something interesting to see, especially as Sub-Saharan Africa becomes not a new battlefield, but more of a new interest area for all these parties.
And that is all for today. So
all right,
it's
yeah. So yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you for watching and listening. I know we're now we had actually a fairly smooth rollout to all of our podcast streaming platforms, and thank you so much, John, for making that somehow work. Don't know how you worked that magic, but it worked.
Yeah, I was going to say you say it was smooth. I spent so many hours banging my head into the desk trying to fight with the IT systems.
From an exterior perspective, it looks smooth, which is all we need at the end of the day.
Yeah, you can't see the storm if it's a cardboard box.
Yep.
Yeah, no. We are now available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Podcast Index, and of course we are still uploading the visual version of this podcast to YouTube for those of you who want to watch us talking on there. If you guys have any suggestions, please do tweet me at Defense Geek, and I will have a chat with these guys and see what we can do about getting ourselves on other platforms in the future. It's been really good to see the analytics for the first week or so since we managed to get the episodes uploaded. You guys have been really keen to listen. We've had a big jump in viewer numbers on YouTube and obviously on Spotify and Apple as well. So really pleased to see that, and really glad that you guys are listening in and enjoying it.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for listening, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time.